Good evening. My name is Steve Drizzen, and I'm the co-director of the Center on Wrongful Convictions. And it's my great honor to introduce Flint Taylor tonight and to co-host with the MacArthur Justice Center this event, this remarkable event where Flint is going to talk about his book, The Torture Machine. You know, I've waited my whole life to introduce Flint Taylor, and about an hour ago, I was tabbed by Karen Daniel to substitute for her tonight. So Flint, I had less than an hour to pull this together, so it's not my A game you're getting. On January 10th, 2003, at DePaul Law School, Governor George Ryan pardoned 4 men on Illinois' death row. Aaron Patterson, who was represented by Flint Taylor, Leroy Orange, who was represented by Tom Garrity and others, Madison Hobley and Stanley Howard, who were represented by Andrea Lyon. And this pardon of 4 men who were on death row, all of whom were tortured by a Chicago police commander named John Burge or his cronies, set the stage for what happened the next day. And the next day, here at Northwestern Law School, where Flint Taylor graduated in 1971, Governor Ryan commuted the sentences of everyone on death row. Those 2 events speak to the symbiotic relationship between the Center on Wrongful Convictions and the People's Law Office. And it's been my pleasure and honor over the last 2 decades to get to work with so many people from the People's Law Office. Jan Sussler, Joey Mogul, Janine, and others, all of whom I consider my legal heroes. For the past 50 years, Flint Taylor has been a thorn in the side of the Chicago Police Department and anyone in power or authority who was engaged in official misconduct and who has violated the civil rights of our most vulnerable citizens. He's going to talk about the torture machine tonight, which is his lifelong crusade to expose the torture practices of John Burge and those who worked under him. I hope we'll talk a little bit about his work on the Fred Hampton case and some of his other cases. But literally, I was looking at the cover of the book today, and there's a quote from Bryan Stevenson. And Flint Taylor is one of the few attorneys, along with Tom Garrity and Locke Bowman and others, who can stand amongst a towering person like Bryan Stevenson. He's one of my legal heroes. He's one of the great lawyers in Northwestern history, in Chicago history, in world history. Flint Taylor.
Thank you, Steve. People at Northwestern and people involved in the struggle against wrongful convictions and for juvenile justice certainly know who Steve Drizzen is, and it is an honor to be introduced by him. I am also honored to have the people on the panel. When I thought about doing this, I thought about doing it at Northwestern because that's where I started out. And I thought about who amongst the so many heroes and heroines in the book could represent on this panel various significant aspects of this story, which does start in 1969. And by no means are these folks the only people who have fought and stood together with us at the People's Law Office for justice in particularly torture cases in the Fred Hampton case. But they certainly are important ones, and they reflect various aspects of the book. I want to read a couple of sections from the book, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what the book represents and what it's about. And then Bernardine Dohrn, another one of my heroes and clients at one point or another of the People's Law Office, will moderate the panel. The first section I want to read actually is the first page. It's the first chapter, and as Steve requested, it's about Fred Hampton, and it's about how I got involved. The chapter is entitled Murder by Darkness, the Assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. The call came in the early morning hours of December 4th, 1969. Come to the crib was the command. The police have murdered Chairman Fred. I was a second-year law student at Northwestern Law School, working with a group of young lawyers, law students, and legal workers in a highly unusual law firm, founded just months before. Our firm, located in a converted sausage shop on Chicago's North Side, was grounded in principles of collectivity and inspired by our Black Panther Party clients. We named it the People's Law Office. As young radicals, we devoted ourselves to aggressively fighting in the courtrooms of Cook County, Illinois, against racial injustice and the war in Vietnam. Our clients also included a revolutionary Puerto Rican organization, the Young Lords, a radical organization of white youth called Rising Up Angry, the Weatherman faction of SDS, and most notably, the charismatic young chairman of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. After I stopped at the law school to pull fellow student Jack Welch out of class, we drove to the small West Side Panther apartment, known to us as the Chairman's Crib. The car radio was blaring that the Panthers and the police had engaged in a shootout that would have done Al Capone proud. Fred and Peoria chapter Chairman Mark Clark were dead. Several of the 7 survivors were wounded and hospitalized, and the others were in jail. All the surviving Panthers had been charged with attempted murder. Jack and I entered the bloody, bullet-riddled apartment. The raiding officers had left it unsealed inexplicably after the pre-dawn attack. The plasterboard walls looked like Swiss cheese, ripped by scores of bullets from police weapons that, as we soon learned, included a machine gun, a semi-automatic rifle, and several shotguns. A large pool of blood stained the floor at the doorway where Fred's body had been dragged after he was shot in the head. And there were fresh blood stains on all the beds in the apartment. Shock and grief soon met with the dawning realization that the police claims of a shootout were bold-faced lies. We were looking at a murder scene. That was the introduction to 13 years of legal and political struggle that myself and others in the office, including Jeff Haas, who's here somewhere in the audience today, were involved in. And that struggle is documented in the first chapter of the book. It's a remarkable saga. And it really galvanized our work. It galvanized our commitment to fighting against racial injustice, against police brutality and police violence, and in fact has informed what all of us at the People's Law Office continue to do to this day. At the end of that 13-year struggle, we had exposed the fact that it wasn't just a murder by Chicago police orchestrated by the state's attorney of Cook County, but it was part of a COINTELPRO program orchestrated in Washington, D.C. by J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. And we ultimately, after going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, ended up successfully settling the case. But more importantly, we changed the narrative of what that case was about. We changed that narrative from a shootout to a shoot-in to a planned program of assassination by not only the Chicago police and the state's attorney of Cook County, Richard Daley, the first state's attorney, but also by the FBI as part of that COINTELPRO program. So in 1982, about the time we settled the case, there was something else that came to light. And what came to light was that Andrew Wilson, someone who had been arrested along with his brother Jackie, who's also here today. Jackie, give a shout out. Had been arrested for shooting and killing 2 white Chicago police officers. And Andrew was identified as the shooter. They were both taken back to Area 2, and there was a detective, actually at that point he was a lieutenant, named John Burge. And John Burge was in charge of the manhunt that found Jackie and Andrew and brought them back to Area 2. And, of course, he orchestrated the torture of Andrew and Jackie Wilson. But nobody seemed to care too much about that. They had caught the cop killers, and in fact, John Burge was decorated for it. Now, the book is called The Torture Machine, and the torture machine is pictured, a replica of it is pictured on the front page. But the torture machine means more than just that box that Andrew Wilson was tortured with, that Leroy Orange, who's also here somewhere, another torture survivor, was also tortured with. But the torture machine is also about Chicago. It's about Chicago politics. It's about the Democratic machine. It's about the Daley machine. And what the book tries to document is not only the horrendous torture by electric shock, the torture by other draconian means that was used by Burge and his men on at least 125, we now know, documented cases. But it's also about Richard Daley II, his role in covering up and refusing to prosecute, and when becoming mayor to continue that cover-up. It's about the police superintendents who also joined hands to cover up, and all those other politicians as well. And so, some 32 years later, after the torture of Andrew and Jackie Wilson, we stand here with this book, and we stand here dealing with that documentation. And hopefully that's what the book talks about. It talks not only about the torture machine, the torture, but it talks about who, in fact, is implicated in this scandal. And I want to read you a couple of other passages. And I want to also give a shout out to John Stainthorpe, who, along with Jeff Haas and myself, were the 3 counsel in the Wilson case. What happened was, after Andrew was tortured and Jackie was tortured, they brought it out in a hearing. The judge denied the motion to suppress their confessions. They went to trial. They were convicted. Andrew got the death penalty. Jackie got 2 life sentences. It went on appeal, and Andrew wrote a pro se complaint. He wrote a complaint to federal court saying he'd been tortured. He named Burge. And after a couple of years of lawyers being appointed to his case and ducking out of his case because no one wanted to represent a cop killer, we, the People's Law Office, decided, after Andrew reached out to us because of our work in the Hampton case, to represent him. to take on the case. That was 1987. And we all stand here today, Joey, myself, and all the other lawyers at the People's Law Office still fighting these cases some 32 years later. But of course, we stand here today with a completely different narrative about what happened than the narrative in 1982 when the torture first happened. And in that trial, what happened was then in 1989, John and Jeff and I went on trial in front of Judge Duff, a judge which you'll read about in the book. He was something else. He paralleled Judge Perry in the Hampton case in terms of the racist attitude that these judges had towards our clients, and derivatively, the hatred that they built up for us. During that trial, or in the run-up to the trial, and Jeff and John and I had a suspicion that this wasn't the only torture case, but we had very little evidence to show that there was anything more than one case. And as few days before the trial started, I got a letter in the mail, and it was in a Chicago Police Department letter envelope. And the letter said, if I can find it here, Mr. Flint Taylor, I understand that you are representing Andrew Wilson in his civil action against several police officers for brutality. Check the following. Several witnesses, including the Whites, and those are two other people that were tortured because they were thought to have committed these murders before Andrew and Jackie were ultimately arrested, were severely beaten at police headquarters in front of the chief of detectives, the superintendent of police, and the state's attorneys. Mayor Byrne and State's Attorney Daley were aware of the actions of the detectives. Assistant State's Attorney Angarola told both of them and condoned the activities. Several of the detectives named in the suit have been previously accused of using torture machines at complaints given to OPS and in motions filed in criminal trials. The device was destroyed by throwing it off Burge's boat. That's why we have a replica here. We built it to the specs that Andrew Wilson described to us. And it has become a symbol of the torture for decades. Ironically, the judge wouldn't let us introduce it into evidence as hard as we tried as a demonstrative piece of evidence. Mayor Byrne and State's Attorney Daley ordered that the numerous complaints filed against the police as a result of this crime not be investigated. The order was carried out by OPS investigator named Buckley, who was close to, here's another big actor, Alderman Burke. Then in all caps at the bottom it said, "Do not show this to anyone. If you want more information, put an ad in the Southtown Economist. You do not have permission to show this to anyone. It is privileged." So we went on trial. We put the ad in the paper, Southtown Economist, which is a paper that's read by a lot of cops on the southwest side. And we got to the part of the case where I was cross-examining Burge. And I was cross-examining him with 1.5 hands behind my back, because the judge wouldn't let us bring up anything about any other suspected cases. He wouldn't let us go into Burge's history in Vietnam. He really wouldn't let us do much of anything. And it was tremendously frustrating, to say the least. And we came back to the office, and we got a couple of letters during that period of time. Both of these were from this anonymous officer. He signed the letters Ty. We named him Deep Badge in honor of Deep Throat in Watergate. And the second letter said, "I believe I learned something that will blow the lid off your case. You should check for other cases which Lieutenant Byrne was accused of using this device. I believe he started right after becoming a detective many years ago. I will not give any specifics until I am assured that these letters are not going to be used ever. And then again, he reemphasized that the state's attorneys knew about this, that many judges knew about this, and attorneys in private practice. Then a few days later, as the case continued and the frustration mounted, I got another letter. Mr. Taylor, as I have said previously, I do not want to be involved in this affair. This is why I asked for the reassurance that these letters would be kept private. I do not want to be shunned like Detective Laverty, since he cooperated with you. Frank Laverty was the Serpico of Chicago. He had come forward and exposed the street files in the police street files cases back in the 80s, and he worked under Burge, and for his reward, he had been moved to Leventon State, demoted from being a detective, and his job was watching recruits give urine samples to make sure they weren't switching them. He then went on to again, for the third time, talk about that decisions were made at the highest level of the state's attorney's office. Of course, Richie Daley was the state's attorney at that time. And then he said, he told us about Melvin Jones. I advise you to immediately interview a Melvin Jones who is in Cook County Jail on a murder charge. When you speak to him, compare the dates from 1982, and you will see why it's important. You will also find that state's attorney knew that he was complaining, and that's why his charges were dropped. That decision was made at the top levels of 26 in California. So John and Jeff and I, with the help of Dale Coventry, who was Andrew's public defender back in the day, went out and found Melvin Jones. And what we found out from Melvin Jones was, yes, he'd been tortured by Burge with electric shock, with the box, 9 days before Andrew had been tortured. And what was really important was that he had testified about this in 1982, so that we had, in fact, corroboration contemporaneously. So Melvin became a key witness, and we took it to the judge. And the book unfolds from there. John Conroy was covering this trial, and he can tell you more about what he saw. But suffice it to say that the judge didn't allow Melvin Jones to testify. We had 2 trials, and Melvin Jones didn't show up, wasn't allowed to testify in either of them. John covered those cases, and out of those cases came The House of Screams, which John wrote. And that was one of, over 15 years, I think close to 20 investigative pieces that John wrote on torture here in the city of Chicago and John Burge. And also, during the trials, there were some remarkable activists who came to the fore. There was a group called Citizens Alert who formed an anti-torture group, and 2 of those leaders were Mary Powers, a wonderful, wonderful woman, and whether Mary was Mary's sidekick or Mary was Mary's sidekick, the 2 Marys were more than just sidekicks. They were butt kickers. And Mary's here for several reasons. Her son was tortured only months after Andrew Wilson was by Burge. So she's a mother of a survivor of police torture. And hopefully the book communicates the importance of the families, and particularly the mothers of those who were tortured. Because from Mary to Lula Bell, who was Ronnie Kitchen's mother, to Aaron Patterson's saintly mother, Joanne Patterson, who unfortunately just passed, as has Lula Bell. They stood with their sons through thick and thin, and they fought, went to demonstration after demonstration. And Mary started to raise hell about what we were bringing out in court and outside of court. They started to raise hell about what the judge wouldn't let into court. And John was also about to write about it. So that was tremendously important. And after those 2 trials, and the judge made sure that we didn't win those trials, the city decided they had to open up a reinvestigation of Burge. And that was in large part due to what Mary did, and also to another very important group that was headed by Jeff and Marielle Nanasi, who very aggressively went to city council and raised issues about police torture and demanded that there be hearings and everybody was demanding that Burge be fired. And lo and behold, there were some independent investigators that were appointed, including Francine Saunders, who is another hero of this story, who bucked the machine and found that Burge should be fired. And in fact, he was fired several years later. So that was a significant victory for all the forces that had come together. And also on the panel is Darrell Cannon. Darrell Cannon is a major figure in the book because of all that he went through, starting in 1983 when he was tortured by 2 of Burge's main henchmen, John Byrne and Peter Dignan, and going through all the legal procedures that Darrell went for 24 years, for suffering in the Supermax prison at Tams for 9 years, and ultimately getting out and becoming a major spokesperson for the torture survivors, and particularly in the fight for reparations. So Darrell is certainly not the only torture survivor, but he's here to represent all of you who are in the audience and who have been documented to be torture survivors. Also, as the story unfolds, there was a young lawyer. She started out as a law student back in the 90s in our office, and she stepped up and has become one of the major lawyers in the torture cases. And I'm talking about Joey Mogul, who's on our panel. And she and I and several other People's Law Office lawyers took on these cases. We dealt with the Aaron Patterson case. We dealt with the Marcus Wiggins case. Later we dealt with Leroy's case and other cases, Michael Tillman. All these stories are told in the book. And what I tried to do in the book was give voice to all of the survivors, as many as I and we had represented, as many as I and we knew their stories. I, in the book, tried to tell them in those voices. And I think that, torture survivor Anthony Holmes, probably going to get here when it's over with. Guess I won't be able to talk to him right now. Anthony was one of the first torture victims or survivors. In 1973, he was tortured with electric shock. And he, like Darrell, has stepped forward after he got out after 30 years and been a tremendous representer of the survivors and fighting for men in prison and also for reparations. So Joey and I and others have, for the past 20 and 25 years, fought very hard, along with others in the movement, to get as much justice as we can. Locke, of course, many here at Northwestern know Locke. Locke Locke is a longtime wrongful conviction lawyer who, and correct me if I'm wrong, Locke, you got involved in torture and death penalty work in the late 90s and became one of the major fighters for special prosecutor in the cases, and in fact was successful in getting a special prosecutor appointed. That special prosecutor, unfortunately, was connected to the Daley machine and issued a report wouldn't indict anybody. But through that fight and through other fights, including the Kochman case, where we also took on the Daleys in their role, Locke has been at the forefront of many of the torture cases, and particularly in taking on the issue of Daley and the machine over the last 15 years or so. And going back to Joey for a moment, that brings us kind of to the present, because Joey was the one who picked up the mantle, who had the idea about pushing for reparations for torture survivors. And of course, we talk about that. I talk about that in the book. And with Darrell out front and some of the other of us working, particularly people from We Charge Genocide and Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, we were able to convince ROM and City Council to grant some amazing reparations. And Joey can speak more to that as well. But the arc of this entire book goes from the passage I read you about Fred Hampton and about police assassination, racist police violence across the entire spectrum, all the way to reparations and to where we stand today. And hopefully it'll make some small contribution to the history of the city of Chicago and understanding really not only about racist police violence, not only about systemic police violence, but how it connects to mass incarceration, how it connects to the courts, how it all is intertwined in terms of the systemic problems that continue from then until now. There's two things I want to conclude my rather lengthy remarks, and that is the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book has a quote from Fred Hampton. If you dare to struggle, then you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then God damn it, you don't deserve to win. And that, I hope, is kind of like sets the stage for what went on and what I talk about in the book. And then in the epilogue, I have another parting shot, so to speak, if I can find it. And it talks about what's left to be done, and certainly there's much to be done, not only with the men who are still incarcerated, not only with the continuing police violence that we see reflected in the murder of Laquan McDonald and the injustice and racism of the courts, which we see with the acquittal of the 3 cops who covered up the murder of Laquan McDonald. And so, of course, we're not finished. And so I say, until then, meaning that these systemic problems are properly dealt with, la luta continua. The struggle must continue. Thank you. And I want And I want to bring up Bernardine Dohrn, who is one of my heroes. As I said, she's not only a hero, but a client, and everybody at Northwestern knows all the wonderful things she did here for many decades. She also is a terrific human rights activist and has done her own part in the fight for justice and human rights with regard to police torture.
I'm going to try to do what we did, some of you may remember, when Jeff Haas's book came out here, and just ask each of you a question or two, some real short. I want you to give a really short answer, but I'll come back to you and you'll get your say, I promise. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So the first question I have is, where were you when Fred Hampton was murdered? Or where did you hear about it first? John?
I was in Champaign, Illinois. I don't remember.
Okay.
I was in Champaign, Illinois in college. I don't remember. Oh, no, wait, that was 68. I was in high school.
No, it was 69, the last month of 69.
Yeah,
December.
no, I was a pretty unaware
You were young
kid.
and unaware.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good enough. Mary?
Oh, I was here in Chicago, and I was probably somewhere doing the Boogaloo or something.
Mike is good for everybody.
I'm sorry, and you were here?
I say I was in Chicago at the time. That's where I was born, and I've been here all my life. And I was probably somewhere doing the Boogaloo or something.
The Boogaloo. You don't remember that morning of hearing about it on the news?
No, I heard about it after it happened, but
Right.
I didn't know about it before then.
Right.
But,
Never heard Fred talk?
oh yes, I've
You
been to
did?
the meetings. I know some of the members.
Okay,
and
that's
I
right.
had planned to go take target practice with them.
Gotcha. Okay. Locke?
I'm sorry I have to answer this question as I do. I was in boarding school in Concord, New Hampshire.
That's all right. You've outlived, sorry, I had to bring it up. You've done good. You've done good. Darrell?
I was at home on the streets when I first heard about Fred. But I was blessed enough to have met him twice.
Uh-huh,
Yes.
great. So you were in Chicago,
Born and raised.
born and raised, me too. Joey?
I wasn't alive.
You weren't alive. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you all, okay? So we got the whole deal here. And
Like the way you put it, though.
now I'm gonna
Very
ask,
simple.
I'll ask you, starting that way now, Joey. When did you first hear about Chicago police torture?
I think it was 1991, 1992. I was in Chicago when the task force to confront police violence, Citizens Alert, were taken to the streets and trying to get Burge fired.
And you had come to Chicago to work at the People's Law Office?
No, I was working at a domestic violence shelter, and I was also part of the well-known Committee to End the Marion Lockdown.
Ah, good. Part of what, I find so interesting is that there were many rivers and streams that led to this, that built and crescendoed. Yeah. Darrell? When did you first hear about police torture in Chicago?
I saw it on TV back in 1968 during the Democratic convention.
Uh-huh.
They had a police riot. Yeah.
Great answer. Good. Locke?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd have to take Darrell's answer too. In terms of specific Burge-related torture, I remember, I probably heard about it before this, but I remember talking very shortly after I took my position as director of the MacArthur Justice Center with Tom Garrity about what I should be working on and thinking about. And Tom said, I represent this guy named Leroy Orange, and there are a lot of cases like this. And We need more people, more lawyers, more activists focusing and thinking about how to bring justice to this group of men.
So you weren't involved in it, Locke, when you were at the University of Chicago clinic?
Oh, I was, yeah, that came later.
Oh,
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah, this is 1992.
Okay,
So it would have been a minute before I went to the University of Chicago.
gotcha. Great. Mary, do you remember for your first hearing of Burge?
I didn't know the name of the police, but I filed my first complaint against the police in 1970
Woo!
at the 11th Street Station. That's where you filed them at that time. And I thought I would get an award for reporting. So
And what did you get? Did you get
they
any?
targeted my son
Right.
and gave him a record. He had never been arrested. He had never been suspended from school, anything. But after I filed that complaint, and we didn't, I don't know whether that was Burge or not, because they didn't give their names. They just beat him up so bad, and then they found out he was 16. And at that time, you wasn't supposed to arrest him when he
Right.
was 16. And they had to let him go, and when he got home, I saw how they had beat him.
Ah.
And I went down thinking that they would be glad to know that these officers had been turned in for this. And they targeted my son and say we've been on the battlefield ever since.
Yes, you have. John?
I am having a hard time remembering when I learned about the Andrew Wilson. I knew about the Andrew Wilson shooting of the two cops, but I can't remember exactly when I learned that he'd been tortured. But I learned that he had a civil suit in 1989, shortly before it started.
So when was your first article about the?
It was in January of 1990.
Okay, great. Flint, you have permission to jump in if you want.
I was just going to say, John was the guy in the back of the courtroom. We had 2 8-week trials. The first trial ended up in a hung jury, and then the second trial ended up with a mixed verdict that ended up on appeal. John covered, I think, every day of both of those trials, and at some point he introduced, we didn't know who he was for a while, he introduced himself, and he was right there with us as kind of a silent, I wouldn't call you a partner, because you were a...
I was a fly on the wall.
Yeah.
You were an independent journalist. Okay. Were you covering the trial for the Reader?
I was covering the trial for the Reader, and this was the golden age of journalism. Who knew? But they didn't. I worked for a whole year on one story.
Wow. Yes, indeed. So I have now that I've had the easy questions, I have the complicated questions. And in my view, from my view, perched doing mainly youth justice and juvenile law, it seemed to me that in a miraculous way, 4 great streams came together to become a mighty river. And that's a step back, but I mean the struggle against the death penalty, both inside from the guys on death row and outside, Alice Kim and company, but mothers, family members. The Death Row 10 in particular, who took the initiative, named themselves, fought their way out, well, out and not out. The tortured confessions, the Burge issues. These are not separate, but they often were done by separate people and organizations. And wrongful convictions, slightly different aspect. So maybe I'm just wrong and they had nothing to do with each other, but it seems to me that the different forces were working, both popular social activism forces and lawyers, on those 4 things. And they maybe competed at some points, but mainly were pushing at a big structure of how criminal justice worked. What do you think? I must go back to you, Joey.
No, I think there's truth to all of that. I think that You know, the struggle for the Death Row 10 was started by Burge torture survivors who were locked behind bars. I mean, and our client, Aaron Patterson, I mean, he called his prison cell his war room. And he, was one of many who was advocating to address the issues of the Burge torture cases. And what was so sad about it is, the work that Flint and Jeff and John did on behalf of Andrew Wilson and getting not only, and the fight to get Burge fired from the city of Chicago. I mean, the city finally acknowledged that Burge was tortured. I mean, that Burge engaged in acts of torture, but then they didn't want to clean house. They just wanted to fire Burge and then have it be this publicity, like say we did what we needed to do, and not deal with all of the damage and harm and devastation that occurred, which included at least 11 Burge torture survivors on Illinois' death row. And I think, so, that was the struggle. People were filing post-conviction petitions saying, hey, I was tortured. Can I bring in this evidence that the city now admits that Burge and others engaged in torture? And the courts were like, no, it does not matter, and it doesn't affect you. And in fact, there were at least 4 Burge torture survivors who lost their post-conviction petitions, including Leroy Orange, who was unable to be able to say, look, there's evidence that corroborates my allegations. And so that was really the fight that, the brothers on the row really brought to us in terms of challenging the death penalty. And simultaneously here in Illinois, people were fighting the racism of the death penalty and the fact that there were these innocent folks on death row. And at that time, as a reminder, there were 13 people who had been exonerated off of Illinois' death row on the basis of their innocence, but 12 killed. And I just want to give a shout out to Chick Hoffman, who's here in the audience.
Yes, absolutely.
Kind of came up with the idea of filing clemency petitions on behalf of everyone on Illinois' death row, asking Governor Ryan to commute everyone's death sentences. And that, I think, was really the vehicle, right? I want to use the words of Miriam Kaba, the container that kind of brought us all together and fighting as one. Because we could all come forth and say, the death penalty is racist. The death penalty is the product of torture. The death penalty is killing innocent people. And that's the way I think we were all able to bring lawyers and activists, the torture survivors, their family members together and row in the same direction to ultimately get the entire death row cleared in 2003 and 4 of the Burge torture survivors pardoned on the basis of their innocence, which was then the giant step towards abolition of the death penalty in 2011.
Right. Just one thing I want to add to that, because I happen to have been interviewing Ronnie Kitchens last week, so I'm back in the groove about these numbers. But of course, he wasn't exonerated off of death row. He didn't come off of death row to freedom. So he, with that exception, he did 8 more years. With that exception.
Well,
You're completely right.
He was the 5th person.
I know.
It's a big fight to get him.
I know. Yeah, I just wanted to say.
I mean, there was others too. I mean,
Yes.
who came, Marvin Reeves, Michael Tillman, others who have
Right.
subsequently been pardoned or, found innocent, that the struggle has continued. But
Of
that
course.
was definitely, yes, it was a sad day and it was a very difficult day. Tom Garrity had put in a clemency petition on behalf of Ronald. There was a debate on whether to seek innocence or not. And, I want to be clear, Aaron Patterson filed his own, clemency petition. He demanded his own innocence, regardless of whether Flint, Tim, Laura, or I thought that was wise to do. I mean, he really
Yes.
took the initiative.
No question. Mark Clemens, who's in the audience,
Yeah.
did that for 20, 30 years. Okay. Filed his own petitions. Darrell, do you want to say something about this?
As far as
These
the death penalty-
various issues kind of coming together, or not coming together.
Well, it's a fact that in due course, that is which in the dark will come to the light. It's been a long time in coming, whether you deal with the death penalty issue, whether you deal with police brutality. It has always been an ugly chapter in the history of America that we have allowed these atrocities to go so long unchecked. But now people are beginning to wake up, and people are beginning to say, we will not tolerate this anymore. We demand a change. And as long as you got activists such as the distinguished people up here on this panel, as well as the ones that's in the audience, and the fact that we have a diverse section of audience here, and this is exactly what we need to affect change today, because without people power, no one is going to change absolutely anything unless you're one of them aldermen who happen to be wearing a mic.
Change comes in surprising ways sometimes. Locke?
No, I think that, that you've said it right, Bernardine. I believe that those were very powerful currents that you've identified, very strong currents. And I mean, the riff that I would do off of that is that, you know, Flint talked about narrative changing, and what happened in the torture struggle was it is a case study in how narratives become transformed. And you know, I just think about all of the many different communities and people who collaborated to make this narrative transform, and whose contributions were absolutely essential to that transformation. Specifically, you know, there were lawyers, to be sure. There were community activists. There was making the narrative change was a literary act in part, and you've talked about this, Bernardine. The idea that what Burge did was to inflict torture, you know, was not written into the script from the beginning. It was a construct that Flint and Jeff and John and others created in order to fashion this as a story that had the power that it has. I think that, you know, today we talk about community lawyering and the imperative of engaging the clients and the wider affected community in the work of making legal transformations happen. Boy, I have learned so much from Flint and Joey in particular about the importance of that, and to sit at their feet and watch them accomplish that, I think has been you know, really one of the blessings of my career. And I do believe, and I don't want this evening to pass by without this being said as well. I think that there is a line to be drawn between this history and this struggle and the example that Flint and the others at the Plow have shown us, between that history and the work of the present time, engaging the black and brown communities of Chicago, the individuals who were most affected by police shootings and police violence, the organizations, including Black Lives Matter, in the struggle to create a meaningful Chicago police consent decree that can be enforced by the representatives of the community in a way that's never happened before. Between that accomplishment and what Flint and his colleagues taught us about community engagement, is very, very important. Not only is this an extraordinary story worth retelling and engaging with on its merit, but it's a lesson, an example to all of us going forward about how we continue in a struggle which isn't going to end anytime soon.
You know, I just want to say one thing, because both of you reminded, well, all three of you remind me that there's other rivers or other streams into this. Joey at one point, and also it wasn't all moving at the same rate. It seemed to, the struggle seemed to fall off many times. It seemed, we couldn't get any traction. People didn't show up to press conferences. It was forgotten. A little bit was done, not really, swept under the rug. And so many times, something that one of you did, elevated it again and somehow recharged the movement. So I'm thinking of Joey going over to, were you in Paris? Where the hell did you go? Geneva. Oh, it wasn't quite as good as Paris. Okay, well, Joey flew over to go to an international UN torture meeting, and many different committees were involved in that, and she went, and within a couple of days, in my telling of it, met everybody, was giving press conferences, everybody knew that she was there, that there was torture in Chicago, that there was massive human rights violations in Chicago. And it came back in the form of headlines in the Chicago newspapers, and it was a spark again, and it reinvigorated a whole range of activity, people inside prison, people outside, mothers and family members. And you can't predict that kind of thing, but you have to keep opening new doors and adding to the stream of people who are fighting. Obviously, Darrell did that once he was out and became a spokesperson, outside spokesperson, as well as an inside spokesperson, and really changed the frame. Mary, another example, of course, is the family members. Many of you're standing into.
I want to say that I had spent years trying to get some help with my son's case, and I realized I was sitting amongst people who had these degrees and everything. So I went back to school in 2007 to get the paralegal degree so that I would have some understanding of law. And the things that make, like they say, ignorance of the law is no excuse. But what's so sad is even when you know it, you can't enforce it because they don't go by the law.
Right. That is
the
so
law
true.
they teach you about, they don't go by that. I got my paralegal degree 2016 in April.
Woo. Woo, woo.
And what I learned during that time, all these years I've been protesting, been trying to fight for justice, wanting somebody to please help me with my son's case. It didn't look right to me, but I didn't know how to explain it. They tell you about due process. My son didn't get due process, and I can prove it. But I need somebody with a degree to help me put that in writing because, like they say, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So I don't know the terms to use, but I know right from wrong.
You know the terms.
He didn't get due process.
That's right.
He was framed up. I got it all. Daly was the state's attorney. When they framed my son up, Daly put a remark in the paper. I got the paper. I went through the artifacts and got that old paper. He made a comment. He was never supposed to get involved in something that happened in Livingston County. That alone prevent my son from having a fair trial.
Right.
Now they say it's a limit. There should be no limit to proving your innocence.
Right.
That's in the law, but they don't follow the law. like they say, they follow the money.
Indeed.
And you have some lawyers like the ones that we've been so fortunate to have who get out here and try to fight for us to reach the consciousness of people, to give mothers and other family members the nerve and heart to know that whatever they say your family member did, you don't have to stop loving them. You don't have to stop fighting for them. And if we unite, they will not be able to treat them like animals.
That's right.
If we stand together, we can demand that. Like they say, that good people are angels. They watch over you. Well, we want disciples. We want somebody that'll fight. We want somebody that will stand up against this system that will not permit people to have fair trials. When I first mentioned the brutality to my son in court, the judge ruled that it was irrelevant. We don't even have to look at that. Well, what about the people that wrote the notes and said that they beat them to try to get them to testify against my son? We got all this. The judge said it's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the case. So how can you fight a system when they don't follow their own rules?
Exactly.
So that's what I had to learn, and I spent many days and hours studying to get that degree. But it still won't work until you raise the consciousness of people.
Right. But I just want to say how much you've been a factor in raising the consciousness of people in Chicago. Before your degree and now after your degree, both.
Right, and can I just add, because Mary's shy, but while she was fighting for Michael Johnson and all of the Burge torture survivors, she also was part of the Illinois Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and she went in and visited people on death row on a monthly basis.
Right.
So when you talk about the rivers and the streams coming together, Mary Johnson was a proponent of all coming together, fighting for her son, fighting for others, fighting for those on death row. She's the selfless person who really brought us all together.
Yeah, and exactly. I just want to shout out also to the other mothers, because I think they are often, particularly in law school settings, not part of the picture, but were a major part of the picture. And not only visited their own sons, but were a communications network for the other people, saw other people in the visiting room, visited, other mothers' sons, and really helped build the network and the consciousness. So I totally agree with you, John?
I don't have a whole lot to add to the formation of the river, but what strikes me is that we wouldn't have had the prosecution of Burge without this river coming together.
Correct.
And because Burge was only prosecuted because Governor Ryan pardoned the 4 guys. Those 4 guys filed civil suits. Madison Hobley got his interrogatories out first, and Burge lied in response to those interrogatories. So Petra Fitzgerald was working with less than 58 words when he brought that prosecution against John Burge. The other thing that I think has happened, if you chart out the false confession exonerations on the National Registry of Exonerations, if you break that down by state, Illinois has 86. The next lowest is New York, which is about 36. And then it goes down from there, with some states not having any. And I think that our lead in this speaks of 2 things. 1, speaks of some bad cops. But 2, it speaks of some great attorneys who have educated judges and juries who now believe that people do falsely confess to crimes. Try selling that in some of these states. You're going to have a hard time. In Chicago, oh yeah, heavens.
Yeah, but I don't want to underplay your articles, because I think that you taught a lot of people through your journalism. And you, in my mind, you linked it to torture internationally. And of course, it did eventually become the era of Abu Ghraib, and it also, but you talked about torture with the IRA prisoners, for example. And I think that these other examples around the world also resonate with the general population, whether we're talking Argentina, you know, all of the countries that had, that ran their legal system based on torture and false confessions. Well, tortured confessions, by definition, false confessions, are, you know, belong in that web, and you helped to create that bigger web, so I don't want you to underestimate how important that was. I think it was hugely important. Okay, now my last question. Well, I have two, sorry. Flint, what did you leave out of your book?
What did you
Just tell us.
Did you
Just
ask
tell
the
us.
question, what do he do best?
What did he leave out?
Oh.
What did he not put in the
Oh,
book?
okay.
You know, that's funny because people have looked at the length of it and they can't figure out how I could have left out anything. It was considerably longer. I had a wonderful editor at Haymarket that helped me to
Feed it back,
feed it back down.
so we could lift it.
But I fought for a lot of things that they thought at first might have been a little bit off the path of telling the torture story. The first was the Hampton chapter, which I was dead set against taking out, and it's in there. There were some other cases that they thought maybe didn't really fit in the narrative completely, like Greensboro and the case against the Klan and the Nazis that I was involved in. We reached compromises on a lot of these things, but really, and Pat knows this, my wife, that most of what went out of it was the personal stuff. You know, my daughter hit the winning shot in a basketball game. I ran the marathon in the middle of the Humboldt Park trial, and the next day, the judge who wouldn't give us the day off had a heart attack. And, you know, kind of those kind of things. There wasn't quite room for it.
So, okay, let me ask you all one last round, short if you can. Maybe I'll start again with you, Flint. What's the next big, I don't know if it's next, death penalty, torture regime, people coming out of prison, depopulating prison. What's next? What's our, campaign?
You named a lot of them right there.
No. We're gonna finish. We're gonna keep the ones we have.
Something new.
Something new. Well, not new, but a focus that will impact everything. Because I think each of these impacted everything. So each of these struggles that you write about.
We must never lose focus on those who are still in prison.
Okay, exactly.
And that is something that keeps me going each and every day. Because of that, I noticed that my alarm went off to let me know that a brother that we was looking for is finally made it in the building, Anthony Holmes.
Yay!
Yes. And I would like to say that anytime that I can look and see people like Leroy Orange or either Jackie Wilson or Anthony Holmes, it gives me additional strength to continue this work. It lets me know that it's not been in vain at all in the struggle to bring about justice here in America. Dr. King once said, a delay of justice anywhere is justice denied everywhere. And that is a true fact. Whether we look at the city of Chicago, whether we look at the Ferguson case, whether we look at any other case that has happened throughout the United States, we're living in some turbulent times along about now, and it's going to continue to take what Chairman Fred once stated, people power is the most effective way in which to bring about change. I've been blessed to have gone to a lot of cities, thanks to Joey, Flint, and others who have decided that Darrell Cannon should, in fact, go to this city, that city, to represent the Chicago connection. And one of the things that everyone was in awe about is the fact that we did not have a riot here in the city of Chicago in order to bring about change and to bring about reparations in which the city fathers, unquote, had to come to grips with this ugly chapter. And when I testified before the city council and I looked at all these prestigious people sitting here in judgment, and after I spoke, they all stood up and gave me a standing ovation. Now, I was dumbfounded because it wasn't about Darrell Cannon. It was about the Darrell Cannons who have yet to receive a measure of justice. So to Leroy, to Anthony, to Jackie, please continue to lend your presence, because your presence do in fact bring about a measure of completion in letting us know that we can make inroads, that the justice system does not have to be just against us. Instead, we're going to see to it that it reflects everyone. Flint Taylor, that's my champion. You know, him, not to mention Locke. Locke never received any notoriety because he's very quiet. You know,
At Northwestern, he
he's a
has
pro.
lot of.
I have been sitting in courtrooms, and he has defended me along with Flint. They the 1-2 punch, you know. And then when Joey, I was skeptical of Joey at first, only because of the fact that I'm a man, and I kind of felt what, you know, a woman kind of represented me. But let me tell you now,
He speaks the truth.
yeah. But now there is nothing that she cannot do on my behalf. You know,
Right
I have
on,
nothing
Joey.
but the utmost
Absolutely.
respect. And please know that, Chick, you have always been a part of the team. You will always be a part of the team. Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in because I do think there's something that we could all do in this room. I mean, there's many things and there's a lot of things to think about. I mean, I think we need to do a lot of decriminalization of a whole bunch of laws.
Yes.
You know, we need to stop looking to the police and prosecutors to bring us safety and freedom from violence, because that is just not working.
Right.
And those are huge overall things. But,
Can I add, Joey, can I add my own thing here?
yeah.
Let's close Cook County Jail. Let's have a campaign to just close Cook County Jail. It's a nightmare. It can't be fixed. It's terrible. We can do it in stages. We don't have to do it all in one blow. But I really think it should be our goal, and the same is true for these downstate hellholes that we have people locked up in. It's done. It's proven itself to be a total disaster.
But specifically also related to to Flint's book and to the work of Flint and the struggle of the torture survivors and the struggle of Mary Johnson is when we got the reparations ordinance passed, right? There are several tenets to the reparations ordinance, and it's about this narrative change, right? And creating the dominant narrative around the Burge torture cases. And we need to understand that that narrative is always going to be challenged.
Yes.
And we have to fight to ensure that that dominant narrative that we have now stays that narrative. And one of the things is that's part of the reparations ordinance is creating a public memorial about the Burge torture cases and the struggle for justice. So on Friday, I think it's May 15th, there's going to be an art show. We have 8 artists who are submitting proposals for what that memorial will look like. Now, this is something Mayor Emanuel and City Council committed to when they passed the reparations legislation in 2015. But since Rahm Emanuel announced he was not going to run for re-election, Emanuel and his administration have not put up one single dollar to pay for that public memorial. We need to raise funds And we need to demand that our new mayor and the new city council administration pay for that public memorial. We must inscribe this racist history into Chicago's landscape so that we never forget what occurred here. So I'm gonna, and please, I'm gonna ask that you join with Chicago Torture Justice Memorials and you help us and donate to raise funds, and that you demand that our next mayor and our next city council ensure that that reparations ordinance be completed by building that public memorial.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Hear, hear. Mary, John, any last words?
I just want to say that I'm so grateful to have been able to take a part in the coalition to end the death penalty, because when I first started visiting, I couldn't figure out what I was going to do. I was nervous, I never know anybody that I knew killed anybody. So to go there, I didn't know what I was going to face. But after that first visit, I couldn't miss going.
Right.
I kept going back because I saw the need. Those guys in those cells, they needed to know that somebody cared, and I would tell them that there are people that care, they just don't know what to do. And it got so, I met people that contributed so much to my life, just getting to know them. And I kept telling them, they say, you need to rest, take it easy. I say, I take it easy when I'm here. But when I leave here, that's when I go and communicate outside what's going on in here. I say, I believe so many of them because the same story that they was telling was the one that I had lived. If I hadn't have been through that, I wouldn't have had no idea that police would do that to you and make you go and tell you they gonna get your mother and your children and have you to sign. I mean, it was just touched me in my heart. So I want to say that I couldn't help mine, but every time I see somebody come out of that place, free man, free woman, I celebrate.
Yes.
So I'm still being paid back. I said in the beginning, I said, thought God was picking on me, but I realized God picked me through my son.
Mary, I just want to add that when I taught here, I taught torture for 7 years, but I also taught, criminal justice and juvenile justice. And my students, to a person, over those years, thought that the thing that changed them the most was not any lecture I gave and not any speech I gave, but going to visit prisoners. It broke through. Every one of them found themselves so blinded by the word and the preconception, and they had no idea. Every one of them, from different backgrounds and so on, were completely astonished to find a person across the table from them, smart, prepared, thoughtful, suffering, human, funny, all like, anyway, it was the main thing, visiting people, that transformed students over the years. Last word.
Well, Locke.
Not last word. Locke.
Flint gets the last word, it's his book.
No, but go ahead.
I was going to say, it seems like all of us are saying the same thing in different ways. And Darrell said it most succinctly, we must never forget those in prison.
Right.
And I think that there are streams that are gathering and building momentum and force that can coalesce into a river that will address this. I think of the movement to end solitary confinement, and I remember that Darrell Cannon spent 9 years in a white box at Tams Correctional Center with no human contact, 23 hours a day locked in a cell with no ability to communicate with the outside world except for phone calls with attorneys, knowing all that time that he was living there because of a confession that was beyond illegal, the experience that would have broken a man less strong than Darrell. And there are men and women around this nation living in those circumstances today. We must not forget. And when we talk about tearing down Cook County Jail, you know, we ought to be thinking about the stream that's gathering around the country, opposing the use of fees and fines, and particularly excessive bail to lock people up who do not deserve to be in jail because they have never been convicted of anything and may well be innocent and are there solely because they cannot pay a sum of money to purchase their freedom. All around the country, we ought to be gathering steam and following the leadership of people like Alan Mills, who's nodding his head out there because he's been doing this for years, man. And fighting to end the carceral state.
Yes.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
Exactly. Okay, questions? 5 minutes. Gotta be quick, because are we late?
Just to follow up on what Locke just said, Darrell, and so on, the people that are in prison. Right now, as we sit here, I believe there are 8,000 men and women in solitary confinement in this state.
Yes,
alone,
sir.
80,000 nationally.
Yes, sir.
This is not a small issue. The Chicago City Council unanimously voted to say that solitary confinement is torture.
Mm-hmm.
This is our own city council. So let that be
That's
the
doable.
next
Yes,
challenge.
okay, great. Oh, where did those, yes.
It struck me in what Joey was saying and several of you that the same narrative is being used, has been used since 9/11 to institutionalize torture on a world scale underneath the U.S. flag. Locke could speak to that. Guantanamo is open. The CIA sites is, there's a book written by one of the greats of international law here in Chicago called The Institutionalization of Torture under the Bush administration, who recently passed away, Sharif Bassiouni. And somehow I think this struggle has to reach there. And Bernardine, you've spoken out any number of times about the institution. And then we have Barack Obama, another person who achieved greatness thanks in no small part to the Daily Machine, who, when he came to power, said, we're not going to look backwards, we're going to look forward. How would you like to argue that as a criminal before the court? Let's not look backwards. But that's what's happened. And so all the keys to these torture instruments are now in the hands of Trump, an outspoken white supremacist and a xenophobe. I just think that we have to take this struggle to that level as well. I really value what you were saying, Bernardine. I think this is a unique confluence of forces that reveals what is actually around the country. I don't think that those numbers of exonerations are because the Chicago police are any worse than all the rest of them. And that the CIA is the grandfather of it all. I would just want to add that to the equation.
No, great, I'm glad you did. Thank you, yes.
The central narrative that I've heard over and over again that annoys the hell out of me is that, well, that was then, this is now, we cleaned up our act. We hear this narrative over and over again. So I'd like our panelists to respond to that claim of the CPD and what message you would send to both mayoral candidates and more importantly to the people of Chicago about that. Oh, it's over with, it's ancient history.
I would take I usually take people from foreign countries who come here, or even from cities in the United States who come here, and just spend a morning at criminal court building. If you think it's over, just come take a look at what goes on every day, and who are the judges, and who are the people coming in shackles. It's so visual. It's stunning. But yes, more.
Well, I don't think you have to say much more than Fred Hampton, Laquan McDonald. I mean, the parallels are so striking, not only what happened, but the cover-ups that went on afterwards, the implication of the judicial system and all of that.
Not only that, for all of you who have smartphones, Google the killing of Fred Hampton. And the thing that I want you to see is how sick Chicago has been for quite a while when it comes to black and brown being killed. When they brought Fred Hampton's body downstairs, before they put him in the paddy wagon, there were 3 white officers in uniform who posed for the cameras and smiled. Here's a man that's dead, that you've shot to death, and you're posing, and you know the cameras are right there in front of you, and you're posing with his body. Now, if that wasn't enough for you, somebody mentioned Bush's name. Well, Bush's Vice President, Dick Cheney, when 9/11 occurred and Bush was off the scene for a couple of hours where nobody got in touch with him, Dick Cheney was in charge. Dick Cheney has admitted that he instructed the military that if any plane that's still in the air and doesn't come down at your first command, shoot it down. Now, we're talking about innocent people on a plane that has nothing to do with what is happening with 9/11, but Cheney didn't care about the value of human life. All he cared about was the power that he had for that particular moment. These are the things that we, the people, have to be greatly concerned about on a continuous basis. We must be vigilant. We must stay the course together as a team. No matter what color you are, we've shown what people power can do. They said a black man could never be in the White House. Barack proved them wrong not only once, but twice. You know, so here again, we, the people, can affect change. Is it going to be easy? No. It's going to always be hard, because anytime change has to come about, you're going to have those that say no. I knew nothing about the electoral vote until this idiot that's in the White House now got in. I couldn't believe that people, after everything he spewed, would vote for him. But the electoral vote is things that we, the people, must be educated about so that we know how to change that. So the struggle is never over. The same way I've been preaching since I've been out of prison, that as long as there's one brother in prison, wrongfully, one brother in prison because of John Burge, my job is never done. And Joey pointed out something to me last year that I'm taking to heart. And when she said, what about some of the women? Nobody has spoke about them. And I told Joey, you know what, you're absolutely right. Even though we don't really know of any John Burge victims like we, the men, have been tortured, but there are, in fact, victims. And we need to address that situation as well. And in the coming months, I intend to get with Joey where she can educate me about things that I need to be educated about, so that when I speak, I can truly say, I speak for us all, male and female.
You do. Thank our panel. Let's thank our panel.
And thank all of you.